I should say this is a. By the way, I'm Andrew. That's Sam. This is a really special treat for me. Number one, to participate in this incredible session on such an important issue. I think you can make a very strong argument the most important issues of our time are wrapped up in the issues of food and climate, and they touch 14 other different pillars that are very important for us to be concerned about these days and talking about as fellow inhabitants of planet Earth. But if anything degrades into any juvenile moment, please excuse that because we're actually friends in real life. So there is a familiarity there, and so something may burp out that's unprofessional. So it will come from me. It will come from me. So I apologize for that in advance. First of all, a big thank you to Sam because I called him up when we were dreaming up this session and said, "What do you think?" And he's just like, "Yeah." He just goes, "Yeah, right away." And that's the kind of person he is. That's the kind of friend he is. So thank you for being here in our hometown and participating in this festival and this session because it's so vital to hear perspective from people who have been on the front lines of so many of these issues and in the rooms, so to speak. And I'm not just referring to your work at the White House. A lot of the things that you've been involved in since leaving the Obama administration have been as important and in some cases, if not more important. When you got up this morning and you're on your way here to the Twin Cities and you know that we're going to have this conversation, was there one thing that you really wanted to make sure to talk about or one thing that is just top of mind when you heard Melvin introduce us and the topic that we're discussing today?
I mean, well, first of all, hi, everybody. How are you? Doing well? This is a real treat for me, and this is one of the great human beings that I know. And so it's like one of our first times taking this, the backstage show on the road.
Doing this, yeah.
So I'm really thrilled to be here. It's just a real treat. Look, I think what animates me in this, I mean, last night I put my 6 and 4-year-old to bed, and it's hard for me to look at them and not think about the future that they're set to inherit if we stay on the current trajectory that we have. And when you look at the science and the data, you sort of see that food is at once the number 2 driver, depending on how you want to do it, or the number 1 driver of a lot of the biggest challenges we face, from emissions to biodiversity loss, water use, deforestation, et cetera. It's also, and the dinner we're doing tonight will really bring this to life around on the front lines of dealing with climate, right? It's already being battered, and our capacity to feed ourselves is really under pressure. But it also then holds, I think, the only set of solutions that can scale in the time horizon that the science says we have. And so when I look at them and I look at that, we have the opportunity to really mitigate the worst of this, and in some ways potentially come out in a far better place than where we started. But I look at them and I realize that we're out of time, and like literally every year counts now. And so I guess the sense of urgency I have to try to accelerate progress sort of animates my getting up and waking up at 4 a.m. this morning to get here and make sure I wasn't late from New York. So so excited to be here and to start continuing to try to push these issues forward at every level.
You talked about urgency, and I think hearing you say it, I realize that's probably the word that I would put to all the ideas that race through my mind all the time. And as someone who's been on so many different sides of this, you've been out in the fields and on the water, and you've been, in the White House, and you've been in the corporate boardroom. What is preventing the scaling up of solutions? Because like so many things, people tend to use that cliche, well, we have the skill, we can solve the problem, but we don't have the political will to solve it. Is that what's at hand here, or is it different?
It's such a great and a big question. To try to be, in some ways, I'm like trying to finish a book. Essentially, really, now that you phrase it like that, trying to answer that question. And I'll try to be succinct. I think there's a few cornerstones that are really preventing these issues from these solutions from really scaling. A lot of it is rooted in our culture. Everybody likes to point at policy. It's like, and it's such an elegant, easy boogeyman to make. It's just like, government policy subsidizes the bad things because corporations lobby, and that's why it's all messed up. Yeah, there's some of that is of course true, and I've been on I got a bunch of scars to tell you about that one. But in the end, honestly, that's like a small piece of it. Fundamentally, our cultural values and what we care about is holding back both businesses and politics. Like if we don't fundamentally start making decisions based on these pressing issues, which right now, by the way, we're not as a whole. Like there's a small percentage of particularly young people who are really animated by these issues and are starting to either vote on them or spend their dollars on them. But on the mass market, that's not happening. Mass market or mass politics, that's not happening at all. And you can only expect politicians to go as far as their constituents are demanding. That's kind of actually how the system is set up to work. We keep saying like our officials should lead. Actually, democracy is about officials following the will of the people. That's sort of how it's actually designed. There should be moments of leadership, of course, but depending who's in office, you only want them to lead so far, right? So we have, and so it's the cultural transformation is the hard work. Like that's the hard work. That's the like person by person, business by business, community by community, starting to shift what we're prioritizing and where we're spending our dollars. And it's not sexy, and it's slow, and it's hard to measure, and so it sort of gets lost, but it's the foundation of all change, in my opinion. And so right now, how that's playing out for businesses, and I'm, know a bunch of them, and some of them are horrible, and some of them are genuinely trying to figure it out. Like they feel the same, both like moral problem, but also business. Like they're like, our business is about to be destroyed by this. They have the chief sustainability officer super empowered. They are driving, and they have all these big plans. They're investing in transitioning their supply chains to regenerative agriculture, like pouring hundreds of millions of dollars. Like it's real stuff. What's happening is that all those, supply chain and procurement teams are everybody's motivated. And then it gets to the CMO, which in most of these companies is probably the most important, most powerful part of how these corporations are structured. And the CMO is like, I can't market any of this. So you're saying you want to spend $500 million for something that's not going to help our business in any way, not going to help me sell more of whatever my product is or beat my competition, which is what we're all paid to do, which what our shareholders are going to hold us accountable for. And things are dying. Why? Because people are not choosing this mayo versus that mayo because that company transformed their supply chain to sequester carbon and build biodiversity and all the rest. And so part of that's on them because they haven't figured out how to tell a story and market it. Part of it's on us because we're just not actually making decisions yet based on these issues. So that's one big part of what I think is keeping these companies from starting to scale. The minute some of these big guys can prove out, if you do this, you'll make money, you will watch how fast this changes. And that's part of our challenge. So that's one big piece of it. I think the other question is, like, who's going to pay for this? And we haven't answered that question. We're talking about in the food sector. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of just, transition away from fossil fuel energy to renewables. That's happening. There will be plenty of fights, as we continue to watch them play out. But the question is, if we're going to transform our food system to both prepare for what's to come and unlock the power of that system to solve the issues of climate, somebody's going to have to pay for it. It's a big transition from how we're doing it now. And let me tell you something. The big food companies are not. Like, they're under tight margins as it is. Every, basis point counts. and they just don't. They'll pay for some pilots. They'll put some real money in, but like just to help start it. But they're not going to pay for it. The question: are we going to pay for it as taxpayers, or are we going to pay for it as consumers? Who wants to pay more for their food?
We are
guy
right now.
That one man. But that's kind of exemplary of the country. We got how many people here? A few hundred people. We got one guy. I love you, man. Thank you for that. But you're kind of on your own. And by the way, a lot of people just literally cannot. Like, cannot. They are barely holding on. And so the idea that we should just start raising the prices of food, I'm just like, yo, that is not coming from somebody who has any idea what the majority of people are going through. And that's in America, like the richest country in the world. Forget about what you start thinking about the rest of the world. So I don't see that as a strategy. Certainly not a political one that's going to win. Have you ever heard a politician be like, I think the solution is raising your prices? Like, people are going to be voted out of office. And so I think, and so what ends up happening is everybody tries to put these costs down on producers, on farmers. And so they need to take on all the risks of the transition, and maybe sometime in the future they start getting some kind of benefit because maybe there's some slight premium that maybe manifests itself in 5 years. That is, one, not going to work. That's what we've been trying to do now, which is why such a small percentage of acreage is under regenerative practices. And it's not right. If farmers are going to be solving the biggest problems that we face in the history of humanity, they should get rich, in my opinion, off that. And so, that is the big question we haven't answered. Personally, and I'm sure, for those of you who follow this, you'll probably disagree with me vehemently, and that's okay. I think I'm totally fine with letting oil and gas and big emitters and tech companies pay our farmers a bunch of money for this transition. Which means, they're going to have to buy some offsets, and a lot of them, at a very high price for high-quality credits. I am totally with, and we're getting a little weedy here, and I'll stop after this because there's lots more to answer, but these are the big ones for me. There's a bunch of greenwashing. There's a bunch of nonsense. There's a bunch of reasons why people fight against allowing companies to buy offsets, and I'm fully with you on a lot of the problems of the system thus far. But in the end, they're the ones who really created this problem. And they should start paying for the big solutions. And the only way they have to continue to transition to renewable energy and deal with the methane and all that stuff, and that should be done, and that's a regulatory question. But in the end, there's a system out here that could start sequestering gigatons of carbon on an annual basis. And I firmly believe that they are the only ones that, one, have the money to do it, and two, have the real responsibility and moral obligation to do it, and one that I think you could get a lot of support around. And that could really pay for millions and millions of acres to be transitioned pretty quickly if the economics work.
Quickly being the optimum word, right? I mean, it's not going to happen quickly from government, right, which technically has the dollars as well. It's not going to happen from, everyone here, we're not going to pass the hat and solve that problem.
No.
It's those big companies that you mentioned before that have the ability to write a check, do it quickly, and create the transformation fast enough to actually get some traction on the problem.
Yeah, because right now you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into carbon capture, like pulling carbon out of the air. If you look at the actual numbers behind that, it's like, I don't know what the latest one is, like $1,000 a ton or something crazy. Like, yeah, it's more than that. Thank you. It's more than that. It is like a fantasy. Like in 20, 30 years when like they keep getting better and better, like maybe that's a scalable solution that could start pulling out enough carbon, maybe. But right now it's a joke. It's like a PR stunt. It's like nowhere close to moving the needle on anything. And there are pieces of technology that are coming on the ag side that can dramatically increase, and some that I'm working on, dramatically increase a farmer's capacity to sequester carbon and store it permanently in the soil. And you have 1 billion people plus worldwide working in food and agricultural systems. You have this huge system like ready to go to start actually putting some of these solutions through. And if the economic incentives were right, meaning we start really paying you to do the right thing, trust me, farmers are extremely smart business people. they are dealing with more risk than most of us deal with in any given day than most of us deal with in our whole lives. And if given the right incentives versus the amount of risk they got to take on, they're going to make the smart choice. They do. And that's what's before us. There's no other technology that I've seen that can start sequestering enough carbon anywhere close to what the science says we have left. I mean, we just blew by 1.5 this year, right? It'll go up and down. But right now, I came here thinking I was going to have to be in like a full snowsuit, and I got a sweater on, So, like, this is like now. Like, that's the thing. It's like the time that we had to kind of like do a little pilot, figure it out, test and learn. Like, we wasted that chance like 30 years ago. And then again, 20 years ago. And then now we're just like, we have to put the systems in place. We have to put the right economic incentives in place like now. And if it does, I'm still genuinely optimistic that we got a shot. But there's no like, let's do one plant that takes out 1,000 tons of carbon this year and see how it goes. Like, that's just not going to meet the moment. And we owe it to future generations to do a better job than that.
Does a part of this, and I know you were discounting our political system entirely a few moments ago. Well, because
just kidding.
Because it's impossible to do certain things without the power of laws, and I want to talk about farmers in general. One of the things that I'm proudest of saying at a public level that was disseminated on television, which is, a mass medium, was sitting on a tractor on a farm in Texas and saying, if you want to know what's going on with farmers, you have to visit a farm. You got to talk to people. You have to see what's going on, because I don't think anyone really realizes that. And it's not the old canard about, kids don't, know that milk comes from cows. I think it comes from a carton in the supermarket, right? I mean, that joke is, we're way past that point. But I think people still don't have an understanding about how heavily subsidized our farm-to-freighter economy is, the amount of subsidies available for farmers who are growing corn for animal feed, and that our classification of food fit for human consumption are called specialty crops, and they're receiving the, no pun intended, the smallest bite at the apple. So don't we, if we're going to create this system, don't we also have to do some vital work in our municipal governments, our state governments, maybe even most importantly, and at the federal level, to allow farmers a little more financial benefit and make it a little bit easier for them? Because right now, most farmers are upside down, and that's why we're seeing an exodus from smallhold farmers in this country.
So, so there's no question, having spent 6 years in the White House, that policy matters, that good policy matters, that there's a lot of bad policy out there, but and I'll get back where I think there's some opportunities there, but that being said, food is inherently a private sector endeavor. And like when we got to the White House, how many of you have read The Omnivore's Dilemma? Yeah, okay. And in that book, Michael's a wonderful man, argues that basically, direct payments to farmers are the thing that distorted the whole thing. It's why a burger is cheaper than a bunch of carrots. And if we only could fix that, everything would be okay, essentially, is the argument. And the reality is, so I went to the White House with my Omnivore's Dilemma and a few other policy books under my arm, idealistic as can be, said to change this, and I was like, we're going to fix the world. And what did we do? We got rid of direct payments to farmers, and what happened? Like, basically nothing. Now, a lot of those subsidies moved into crop insurance, and so crop insurance is really the big opportunity to change and improve things. But what we forget is that there is a very mature economy around corn and soy, and that actually way more than subsidies, what's affected this is that we've had 30, 40, 50 years of heavy investment in innovation around how do you grow corn and soy. And we can now grow, I don't mean to go down some rabbit hole of debate around the externalities of corn and soy production and all the rest, which we can if anybody wants to ask that question. But I don't want to bore most of you. But we can just grow corn and soy in a highly efficient manner, and because of the cheapness of those commodities, there's a big economy that's been built up over that. So even if you got rid of all that subsidy, very little would actually change in terms of what ends up on our plates. There's only a couple places that the federal government has direct control over what we're eating. One is school nutrition, which we did a lot of work on. Military, which actually buys a ton of food, which we did a lot of work on. And WIC, which is also, we transformed that program. One of the most underappreciated, most effective programs the federal government has. That's the Women, Infants, and Children's Program. Feeding 1 and 2 babies are on WIC in the United States, which is startling. The rest is just producers selling to processors, selling to food companies, selling to us. And that's where the cultural part comes in. Because the government is shifting and shaping that around the edges. It's really around the edges. So yes, as we try to make a giant transition to much more regenerative systems, and there's a lot of interpretation of that, but let's just sort of, for the sake of the conversation, say that's a direction that we want to head in. There's policies and incentives that should be put in place to incentivize or reward growers for moving in that direction, and that is actually starting to happen. But no matter what, we're going to grow a lot of corn and soy. We just are. Energy policy and ethanol policy, that is a disaster. Talk about a train wreck. Like, that's a train wreck. If we want to have a big fight, we can fight there. But in the end, if we spend all of our time fighting and not actually figuring out the places where growers just can move in a better direction because they're rewarded better, then really what we're just going to do is fight. And in D.C., as we learned dealing with restaurants, if you're just fighting, you're not going to get very far. You have to build big coalitions where big forces can align, and you start moving in a better direction. And I do think, so the problem with subsidy policy fights are around, like, I want to take from this and give to that. Well, that means you have a huge constituents of very, very powerful people because they operate in every state who are not going to fight against you. Generally, you're not going to win those, which is why it's kind of stayed the same. What I do think is emerging, so when we were in the White House, first of all, rural America generally hated us. If you said the word climate change, they looked at you like you were the devil, for real. They were like, but my weather's changing, but that climate change thing is a total farce. And they just thought we were the actual enemy, generally the enemy. Now, because of some of the opportunities for farmers to have a new revenue stream from carbon or other ecosystem services like biodiversity or water, the biggest, most hardcore ag groups are now partnering with the most serious environmental groups to come up with policies to try to make this incentive structure work for growers to start changing their practices and make more money. If you would have given me a chance to make a bet, I would have bet my life's earnings that would not, from my perspective when we were in D.C., that would not happen. And so there's an opportunity that's starting to emerge and a complete reshuffling of the political, on-the-ground landscape that is going to allow, I think, for some real progress to be had. And in that, then it's like, okay, I'm open to shifting that policy because now it could actually benefit us, not just take from us. And that's the kind of strategic thinking at every turn, in D.C., on the state level, in a local business. But how can we find the wins that everybody can kind of get around to start actually moving forward, as opposed to thinking that the fight in of itself is some sort of victory. There's so many advocates just like, I just want to fight. It's like, well, that doesn't actually, unless it's going to win, unless you know you're going to win, it doesn't matter. So the question is, how do we win? How do we start really moving the ball down the field and making progress and starting to shift acres and shift what's in our food? That's the only thing that matters. And turning down the dogma and finding those opportunities, I think, is the goal. So policy, yes, really does matter. But it's not the magic bullet that most people have been led to believe.
So common ground, changing our cultural values, aligning with people that we may not have agreed with historically for a long time, seizing that commonality and pushing forward in that direction, generally speaking, is where you see solutions and opportunities, generally speaking. For people who are sitting out here who are like, okay, so how does that actually get achieved? What's something on the ground that we can actually point to and align ourselves with? I mean, I'll tell you a quick little Minnesota story. I do a lot of work in Africa with the UN. Drought-resistant grains that have come from over there are something that we need to invest a lot in. We have a lot of success in helping grow more things faster in Africa because there's more progress to be made. So It's kind of a false fact, if you will, but there are solutions in there. And, I've been going back and forth there for about 20 years, predating the work that I was doing with big, NGOs and things like that. And one of the things that I learned was General Mills, a Minnesota company, is, I think, now the second largest. It used to be the largest, and I loved saying it all the time. But now we're the second largest, but it's still very significant. General Mills is putting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I think it's up to about $500 million a year, into researching drought-resistant grain. And, of course, the reason is they don't want to go the way of Kodak, right? Their biggest profit center is Big G, which is their cereals division. So they have a vested interest in making sure that grains like Kernza, for example, can become something that's valued, can be farmed, that we can get more grains per square meter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and transform it so we're using less wheat. You can just keep going down the road with this, but you can understand why it's in their best interest to do so, right? So I always was saying that as much as we might shake our fist at some big companies, oh, you're putting too much sugar in cereals, they really need to be our allies, right? I mean, they have the distribution points, they have the size, they have the money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of like the big energy companies, having them put in dollars into the system, that's probably the fastest ways to help support the good works that companies are doing. So two questions come out of that. One, what are some things that everyone here can sort of wrap their arms around and say, hey, there's something that I can plant a flag in and tell people in my group and email my friends that I heard today. Stories of success that you have found, particular ones. And then the follow-up to that is, what else can we do to change the culture value narrative? I feel like I'm sort of preaching to the converted here a little bit, that the majority of people in here, because I don't see anyone holding up an angry sign, no one's throwing an egg at me or us.
We're only halfway through. I'm sure we'll get to that.
It might get there. But in general, the people who have come here because they already have a toe, a leg, or are fully immersed in the same fight that we are. So where are the success stories, and what else do we have to do to shift that culture value proposition with the people who are outside of this room?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're two parts. Yeah, they're the perfect two questions together. First of all, in terms of the big, the big company responsibility. Not only do I think they're the only path. Like, without them actually seriously transforming how they're producing their food, none of this is going to matter. Like, scale matters. Like, ideally, would we like every company to be small and every farm to be a diverse, regenerative, multi-crop, utopic farm? Yes, I would love that. That sounds amazing. But, like, the reality is, well, I'll just say, I went to the thing that changed me in the White, the way the White, well, it changed me in many ways, but the one of the most important things that it did is I went into the White House with all the reading I did and my kind of ideal vision for how I thought the world should be. And like many of my friends would then like look at how the world was and be like, this is so messed up. Like, this is all terrible. They're bad. We got to fix this, blah, blah. And then when Michelle Obama says, okay, now fix it, you're like, damn, okay. Go on. I want real change. I want it to be for real, for people, for kids. Like, go do it. What that forces you to do is to start with actually where the world is and then try to figure out how you can take where the world is and move it towards those ideals, which is a profoundly different way of thinking about it. And it forces you to just understand, like, what is the reality. Right now, the reality is whether we like it or not. It kind of doesn't matter whether we like it or not. That these are the companies that are feeding most people. Do small, mission-driven, values-based companies have a big role to play? Yes. They're the ones sort of forging the path and starting to take bits of share from the big guys, which is why they're going to change. If that doesn't happen, these guys will have no reason to change. So both are critical as an ecosystem to change. But if they don't change, like, none of this is going to matter. So we have to support the ones that are doing that kind of work and beat the crap out of the ones that aren't, right? Like, and once that starts to prove that they can have successful businesses in this transformation, that's critical. So one thing to do is to work in your own choices to start buying products that are making any kind of notion in this direction. And frankly, right now, I'm actually less concerned whether it's real or not, which might be a controversial thing to say in this room. But the more claims that are being made that are starting to generate more revenue for these companies, like, that's going to start to make movement. Then it's our job to start looking under the hood and be like, this is complete bullshit. I don't know if I can say that here, but, like, it is what it is. I don't see any kids. And starting to hold them to account. But you know, we don't have time to start doing some kind of deep analysis of General Mills' supply chain and make sure that this box of cereal, who's going to do that? But if one company is saying they're doing something good and the other one's not, let's pick the one who's, like, starting to push. That right there will have a big impact. And I think our work is to then take, so one, it's the decisions that we're making, the products that we're buying, the makeup of what's on our plate. Obviously, we have to eat less animal protein, especially the larger animals. It's one of the easiest things all of us can do to reduce our negative impact on the environment. I am not a vegan or a vegetarian. I'm almost certain I never will be, as a chef who loves all kinds of food. But reducing the consumption of that is really, fundamental first step for all of us to make. But the next set of work is to then talk to your families about it. Talk to your cousins who are on the other side of the issue. Like, talk to people in your workplace. Talk to people in the community, local representatives. Vote. Right? So at every level that we engage, start bringing these values into those conversations, because that's how change quietly, and you don't know you've made it. Because you never know when one conversation, as we were talking about earlier, is, like, going to stick with somebody. And they'll probably be resistant, and they'll probably say whatever. But they're going to go home and they're laying down in bed like, yeah, I do care about my kids. And wow, I didn't realize, like, they may not have the kind of food to eat in the future. And it's like, that's the hard work of cultural change. Cultural change happens, like, person by person. Like, I remember my own personal, I was a baseball player growing up. And there was a guy who I played with, Quran, he got drafted. He was a year older than me. He had just been drafted. And we were out late, kind of partying, whatever. And we stopped at the convenience store, and I got a Mountain Dew. And he looked at me like, you drink that shit? Like, what are you doing? That stuff is poison. Look at that. That's poison for you. I have not drank a soda since. Just because he, like, made me feel like that was like, what am I doing? Did you not understand? So these little moments, like, matter. So having these conversations really matter. And that's how you start to shift. So if we make better decisions and we talk about our better decisions and we try to bring that into all of the different community groups, wherever we're living our lives, and we start to then translate that into our politics, like, that's what change really looks like. And you've seen it play out in different ways and different aspects all the time. Food is one of those things, because it is such a core to who we are and our very identity. In some ways, it's harder to change, right? Because everybody has a sense of who they are based on what they eat. But that change, like, as it happens, is profound, and it sticks, and it really becomes a manifestation of who we are as a people. And so I think that's really the work. And that's the hard, long, but very rewarding work that underpins all the other change that we need to see.
So that includes, and these are sort of yes-no questions, that includes where we shop for our food.
Yes.
It includes what restaurants we choose to go to.
For sure.
That includes what we cook in our homes.
Yes.
I mean, I know in our home, we reduced our meat consumption 65%. I mean, we just have.
Most people don't keep data on that, but I love that you do.
Well, I had to because I've been telling people for years, you need to keep a notepad in your kitchen and write down what you're eating every day. Do that for 2 or 3 weeks and then add it up.
Yeah.
And you want to see how much of what you're eating because no one really knows. And I keep I kept, because once you learn, you then make the change, kept a pad by the garbage can. And you write down everything you throw out. And I realized I was spending a ton of money on fruit. I was really good on vegetables. When the carrots and celery and onions were basically you would consider them rotting, I was trimming them and making soup, right? And I'm like, look at me. And I'm dumping 4 or 5 pounds a week of fruit because I'm saving everything else but not fruit. And because it was taking such volume in my freezer. And I know a lot of people out there are going to say, make jam, do this, do that. Well, I'm making soup. There's only so many burners. I only have so much time. So the reality was when I looked at what I was buying, what I was throwing away, which I encourage everyone to do this, you can just buy less fruit. We were eating fruit every day in our house, and that was it. But my problem was I was buying too much. Oh, my God, these plums look great. These tangerines look great. Got to have a bunch of bananas. And I still have bananas frozen in my freezer for making banana bread, right? So it's just you learn what your personal choices are. I love this conversation. There's one big area that's kind of like my thing. You didn't purposely leave it out, but that's the ocean. And when I say that, I also mean our freshwater systems, lakes. I understand we're landlocked here in Minnesota.
Well, you got a lot of lakes, pretty famously.
We do. Water is water is water, right? What is it you see we can be doing when it comes to, you talked about a billion people before in this industry. We have nearly 1 billion working on the water, and we have about almost 2 billion who that's their primary source of protein, right? And we have to protect and produce out of our oceans. I mean, that's, you talk about bullshit, things like Seaspiracy, when I see them on Netflix, freak me out at what people are believing. You can't just turn off all the water systems. But we can produce and protect out of it, and I know, that's what I'm working on, because you got to pick your fights, right? So totally. I know for you, regenerative ag is a huge, huge piece of what you're focusing on. With me, it's our oceans and aquaculture. Tell me what you're seeing there when you're in your life, when you're not talking to me on the phone late at night about our kids.
Yeah. Well, first of all, one, thank you for raising this. One of the things I realized a couple years ago is how biased I had been as a land-based mammal to oceans. I always sort of...
Oh, don't say that. I'll get you involved in some stuff.
I'm in. Yes, I'm in.
Yeah.
I just committed publicly. I'm in.
Yeah.
It's not that I didn't intellectually, know that's there's a big problem with a lot of people, all the rest. But in terms of just how I was thinking, I wasn't rooted. I'm from Chicago, right? So I just wasn't rooted in that, part of the solution, problem set and solution set in the same way that I am on these other pieces. So it was a really, I got my kind of butt kicked in this one meeting by this guy who basically called me out on it. And I was like, you're so right. Our oceans are absorbing about a third of the carbon or a quarter of the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. They're under grave distress. We'll talk a lot about that tonight for any of you guys who are joining us. If you're not, you should, for this dinner we're doing together tonight around climate and actually eating a lot of the foods that might not be around for our kids and grandkids and talking about really what's at stake, of which a lot is rooted in our oceans. And, we lost 80% of the snow crabs over the last 5 years in the Pacific Northwest. 80%. So we're seeing devastation playing out like right before our eyes. There's the overfishing, of course. So that's a separate, I mean, they're all interrelated, but that's kind of a separate piece. Like how we manage these fisheries is one thing. But the environmental impact that our emissions are having on the oceans are just completely devastating. And talk about disruption for the globe as, you know, these various populations of seafood are just either vanishing or moving, and whole ways of life are being completely turned on its head. You know, I'm going to put the question back to you about what you think we should do. It seems to me that I don't see how. What's interesting in our chef community is like there's like deep inherent contradictions on this issue, where, you know, all chefs are like, farm fish is garbage. You should only eat wild fish and wild salmon and the rest. I'm like, there's just not that much of that left. So it seems to me better managed fisheries has to be a key part of this, but also fundamentally better policies around how we farm and produce fish is the only way we're going to continue to be able to, because we also have government policies saying eat more fish. So it's like a real mess, because it's like, okay, we got no more fish, but you're supposed to eat more fish, and farm fish is terrible, so only eat the fish that's dwindling. You know, it's like, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, you do have a cultural problem, just like you do with the land-based issues, right? That we want to eat shrimp, salmon, halibut, tuna. Nobody wants to eat. You know, I was fascinated. The latest study just came out in one of these like weird documents that I get. It's like 70 pages long, and I can't understand the first paragraph. And something made me just flip through the pages, and I saw this graph. Do you know what the number two most consumed most consumed animal in the world is? Number 2, sardines, right? And the next day I had a meeting with a sardine company that is working with me to try to figure out how to get you to eat more of them, right? Because it's popular everywhere else in the world. And it reminded me of 30 years ago when I was like, goat in this country is kind of like soccer. You know, when we see it, no, we see it, we eat it, we like it. It's like, oh, that's good, and it's great for everyone else. But, you know, God forbid we eat a small animal that can be easily raised, requiring very little energy, harvest quickly for those that do eat meat, et cetera, et cetera. Goat is a really great solution, right? And super healthy, low in fat, high in protein. So I think I think a lot of it is cultural. And a lot of it is about where the dollars go. You know, we have to change our app. We have to eat small fish with the heads on them. We have to eat aquaculture. And Sam, you know this from your days as a chef. I would get farm trout and farm salmon at the restaurants that I was the chef in when I was doing that, and I would be like, "This is garbage." I mean, it's mushy, it's soft, it's not right. And then I started to get fish that was awesome. And I will tell you right now, as someone who is a trout fisherman, and when I can take a fish, I have a frying pan, I build a little fire, and once a year, I enjoy that trout that I caught in that pan with watercress from a half mile down the river where I went and plucked it. And I do that, and I do that because I'm a lotus eater, and I can, because it's my own personal offset. I'll just work a little harder on the phone the next day to offset that. But at the same time, Riverence trout out of Idaho is as good, if not better, than wild, because they now have systems where the trout are ranging freely, feeding on natural foods that are in this river system. It's an incredible product. Look for it in your store. It's really, really, really great. There are a handful of salmon companies that are doing incredible work. We have figured out no more copper netting, 5 less fish per square yard, a feed system that scatters many times so that nothing drops to the bottom of the ocean. Makes the fish swim around a little bit more too. Colder water. Everyone who's doing the right work is moving their pens to colder water. Aquaculture is really, really great. The problem, and you talked about money before an investment, for me, in the water systems is that the billion-dollar investments are going into solutions that only make rich people richer 30 years from now. What do I mean by that? Cell-based tuna is, I mean, I was just at, a big conference 2 years ago, and a whole bunch of people were applauded for dumping $1 billion into cell-based tuna. And I went and I tasted it later that night at a there were 10 of us that were invited to go taste this and talk to the owners. It can't scale. It requires too much energy. If they sold it to you now, it's $120 a pound, right? It won't get that. So no one can eat. It will never be anything. And 25 years from now, and I think we will still have a planet, those guys will make money on it because it gets sold somewhere or be some fantastic write-off or whatever. I'm not an accountant. What we need to do is put money into the systems that are working today, like aquaculture. How many people know that some of the best shrimp in the world is being grown in northern Minnesota? Right on. Some of the best shrimp in the world is being grown in northern Minnesota. We have to do more to incent those. It's the same thing as land-based farming. We have to do everything that you said about land-based farming with water-based. Now, the other thing is seaweed and sea vegetables, right? They're estimating that in 10 years, more pounds of seaweed will be harvested for human consumption in America than pounds of potatoes. Let that sink in. That's how fast the growth is right now. One of the problems is that real estate-wise, all of our coastal communities are houses. So it's really, really difficult. It's really, really difficult.
And I think it goes back to, what we value. I think the cellular investment is happening in, throughout every protein. And I think the question we have to ask, and I will say, knowing a lot of those folks, having not invested in any of them, they come to it honestly, mm-hmm. right? Like they see a big problem and they think that this is a solution. So I don't question their motivations in that regard. But I think we have to ask ourselves, it's funny, I said this at a big investor conference, and it was like the room was like, like you're thinking about values. It was like a shock to everybody. But we have to ask ourselves, like why do we eat? And what's the future that we want to create? Just because technically you could figure something out doesn't mean that's what we want. And for me, like, the food we eat is one of the, if not the only kind of remaining interactions that most people have with like the natural world on a daily basis. And to further remove, I think a lot of the challenges that we've come up against is because we have been removed from that much deeper connection to the life on planet Earth and the ecosystem that sustains us. And to further remove ourselves, that last bit, to be, producing, our fish or our meat in a giant tank in a huge factory, feels to me would break that last connection that we need to rest a lot of these solutions on and build a different sort of set of cultural values. And so, yes, so I agree with you. There's solutions right now that are working, and investing in building people's understanding about why this is better and why we need to support it and why we need to protect it is the work. And that's the future that I would like to leave for my kids, not one where we're growing a pork chop or a piece of mm-hmm. sushi. And I think those are the kind of questions we need to start to consider. It's not that every solution is good, or I think good or bad is wrong. It's like it's not every solution of a future that we want to manifest for.
Or fast enough.
Totally
one thing traveling the world, you see these other cultures. 2 months ago, I was in New York City. There was horse mackerel on the menu. I ordered one. I think it was $50, right, for one little fish. Okay.
Welcome to New York.
Well, I mean, it's the same in Chicago.
Don't get me started on preschool costs.
Same in Chicago and L.A. In Namibia, I stood on a beach 8 years ago and watched them cast nets and pull in 1,000 pounds of horse mackerel, and it was given to the laborers as food, and the rest was sold for like $1 a kilo or 50 cents a kilo U.S. because it's used as bait. Okay? So as you go around the world, we can learn things in other places. One thing that I've learned is only to hijack you and the audience for so long. So before we turn our attention to it, I do want to underscore one thing. We're going to open up for questions in just 30 seconds. You can go to Great Northern I have horrible vision, and yes, these are glasses that actually help me see. But I believe we still have a few tickets tonight for the dinner that Sam was talking about. So you can go to greatnorthern.com, thegreatnorthern.com, and sign up for the Last Supper, where we're actually going to be tying a lot of this together with food. But for the next 10 minutes, we have time to take a couple of questions from the audience for Sam. So where is my person? There you are. Thank you, my dear.
Got a bunch.
And we'll just pass the microphone around. I see a couple hands up. We'll get to you as best we can. And I know in my finishing remarks somewhere I've gotten like 8 versions of it to make sure I say the right thing. They're worried about me.
Rightfully so.
I know that we'll be downstairs and available for conversation for a couple minutes after this with people that want to talk. So go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us today. I guess I just wanted to get into a little bit. You had said, big corn and big soy, they're not really going anywhere, these mature industries. And I don't necessarily disagree, right? But it's just kind of hard to hear as, a student of the, negative impacts of industrial ag and monocropping. Yep. So I guess I'm curious, like in your eyes, what are the big steps that corn and soy can be taking to make that production more sustainable? And maintain efficiency when right now we're seeing like such dependence on chemical inputs and stuff like that.
Wonderful question. I think that's the right question to be asking. It doesn't mean that we still shouldn't push for saving smaller, diversified farms and incentivizing more, young people to get in that kind of agriculture. So it's not that we should just sort of throw our hands up and this is what it is. Like we need to keep pushing towards, a future that we believe in and we think is best. I just think we also have to be real with ourselves that, there's 95 million acres of, it changes a little bit, like 95 million acres of soy and 100 million acres of corn. Like, no matter what we think, like that is going to be largely the case for a long time. It may shift a little bit here and there, but like if we ignore that, it's to our peril, right?
Because we don't have enough time.
We don't have enough time, and that's just what it is. Like, we can stomp up and down all we want, but people are going to plant soy this year and they're going to plant it again next year. So the solutions have to take that into account. And so I think that's exactly the right question to ask. I think it starts with, and this is starting to happen, like there's some pretty exciting work being done where through some partnerships with some big guys actually, you're starting to see in Iowa cover crops being planted, no-till being implemented, some better rotations starting to happen. It's each sort of microenvironment requires different practice changes. So it's hard to give like a big broad brush for every farm. I think part of what's interesting, challenging to communicate about, challenging to have standards on is that when you start to actually think about what this piece of land needs, there's a lot of different answers to that depending on what had happened before, the soil type, what's been put on it. I think you're seeing a lot more bio-based fertilizers that are really important to replacing the synthetics. And so building the soil health through different amendments, naturally occurring amendments, I think is critical. One thing that I do think is coming, so I'm on the board of a company called Loam Bio that's has fungi microbes, naturally occurring microbes that are sequestering like 3 tons of carbon per acre per year and storing that far more permanently in the soil because of how the fungi bonds to the carbon that it's pulling down through the roots. So I do think there's like this combination of, better inputs from a fertilizer standpoint, better genetics too around water use in particular and drought resistance is going to be critical. And then these better practices. You can start to, look, is a big, 10,000 acre soy farm, like would I close my eyes and want to see? No. But I think we could dramatically reduce the negative inputs that system is having, negative impacts that system is having on the environment, and turn that into a real like carbon farm. That's possible. And that's possible like basically in the next year or two at some real scale. And that, that's worth pursuing aggressively. And I think over time we can continue to try to incentivize, more diversity in the genetics of even within soy or corn, and then more, diversified farming systems that have the right economic supports. But I think there's a lot to be done. I mean, the scale can also be used as a force for positive change too, right? Because you can take that monocrop and start putting solutions through it pretty efficient manner if the numbers work for people. So it's not necessarily our ideals, but I think there's a lot of impact that could be had from there. So I think it's really a great question to continue to work on.
We have another question. Microphone is coming to someone.
Thank you. I love this, and I could ask 1,000 questions, but I'm going to just say one thing and then give a shout out. The first thing is I love the shade you threw at direct air capture, because it's very true, and it's where billions and billions of dollars are being invested. Science isn't even proven, and it doesn't have the output, and it requires so much water and energy to even do.
Yep.
There are so many better solutions. The founder of Carbo was here yesterday speaking about their amazing solution, for which I am a part of, which is great. That's not my shout out. But I encourage people in Minnesota to look at it, because they were the winner of the Minnesota Cup, and they are doing a lot of things locally, but they're also scalable. The shout out is actually for a local brand that's not General Mills, although they're great, but Land O'Lakes. They actually have a company called Truterra that does work with a lot of farmers for the cropping and increasing their yield and all that, which I have nothing to do with. I thought it was very amazing, and speaks exactly
Land
what you're
O'Lakes,
talking about.
the new administration, over the last 5 years, if you had to pick a Minnesota company that's done the most, has changed dramatically the direction of their company. They have real values, and they're marching towards a goal. It's a great reminder. We have time for one last question, because I'm hijacking the meeting. Lock the doors. It's a joke.
Hi, thanks so much for a really interesting talk. Sam, you mentioned a couple of times that, what kind of future do you want for your kids, and you think about your kids when it relates to this environmental topic. And I recently read a study that said that is one of the more powerful, messaging tactics of, talk about the kids, talk about future, and that's much more effective than saying, oh, you need to, be a crunchy granola environmentalist. So I'm wondering, in the work that both of you do as such strong communicators, do you have other ideas of how people can have those conversations with the people not in this room? And what kind of topics or messaging would help, basically win the battle of hearts and minds?
Yep. It's a great question, and honestly one I'm spending a lot of time on. And that plays out in different, depending on the sort of the context of the conversation. I think there's nuance to the answer. One, I do think, Michelle used to say this all the time, we'll do for our kids what we won't do for ourselves. So thinking about understanding what's at stake for them, which we don't. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about tonight at dinner. 2 degrees, that's not very motivating. But thinking about what that actually means for our kids and the future that they're set to inherit, and we will basically be the first generation that's going to pass down a far more worse world for our kids, and certainly in the history of the United States, if we continue to stay on this track. And I mean by a lot. Their quality of life, their life expectancy, and their quality of life is going to be so far diminished from what we had if we stay this course. So I do think that's a very powerful, and helping people understand that, because the language of talking about climate and then the language talking about that has been totally disconnected, right? Because we keep talking here, we have to talk here. That's the big difference. And that's, by the way, the power that food has. Talking about energy policy, wind turbine, nobody, what? That's all here and that's all policy. Food speaks straight to your heart, and that's what tonight's about. That's what we've been missing, and that's why it's been a giant failure so far to really galvanize most people, because we have not connected this issue to what people care about. When it comes to like choose this food, not that food, like I think the other thing, and you said it, like we continue to try to make everybody either foodies who have to love food or hardcore environmentalists, but people don't got time. You know, some of us do, and we should keep pushing that, but most people don't have time for that. They got like 3 kids and a spouse that's crazy, and parents are getting old, or like whatever the case it may be, and like, you know, it's a lot to deal with. For me, and like when I'm talking to companies about like what I think they can do, and I'm actually doing a lot of work. We actually invested in a company that tests products. They do in-home product testing. It's called Highlight, a wonderful company. Had nothing to do initially with climate change. We decided to make the investment because everything we do is, you know, mission-driven, to stand up a climate practice, to start testing, add questions around climate and sustainability in every product they test, to try to crack this very question. And we're just started, but my instinct says, instead of trying to get people to figure out, like, to care about regenerative ag, which, you know, is not going to work, is to help people buy products for basically 3 reasons. 1, taste. 2, taste, quality, and price. Like, it has to be seen as a high-quality product that tastes good that I can afford. That basically motivates almost all decision-making. We have to redefine what quality means, in my opinion. Like, no longer can a product that destroys the environment, destroys my kids' ability or chances to have the same kind of food, could be considered a high-quality product. That is a trash product, in my opinion, at this point. And when we think a product is high quality, we tend to think it tastes better. So even if it's the same thing, our perception is going to be that those kind of products. So trying to root these values in what people already care about, and so you can apply that to different contexts. When it comes to food, it's like, this is a high-quality product. Let me tell you why. Because it was grown in this way that's actually protecting and building the health of the soil, which is better for the product and better for the future. That is what matters, and that already matters to you, right? Well, then let me help you redefine what that means in the modern day. That's the kind of work. We have to meet people where they are, not try to keep pulling them to where we are. We have to go to where they are. And if we do that, you can kind of really, you know, connect on their level and what motivates them. And if you care about anything, you should care about food and climate. Care about education, national security, healthcare policy, literally whatever criminal justice, racial justice, literally all of these issues and all of the progress that has been made is going to get completely wiped out if we stay this course. And so you can put the messaging in whatever they already care about, because it's totally relevant to literally any issue on planet Earth right now. And that, I think, is how we can start to make a lot more progress and build much bigger coalitions and start to shift the broader culture.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope to see many of you tonight at our dinner. A huge thank you to Sam for coming and spending this day with us. I have the latest version of my final remarks here on my phone. Forgive me for not having it ready, but I want to make sure I get this right. Thank the speakers in the audience. I already did that. We will be available down by Fika to continue this conversation. Stick around if you're staying for the next session. Make sure to check in for that session at registration or via the self-check-in feature. If you're not sticking around, please make your way downstairs to Fika for food and more conversation. This is not the last session of the day, so I don't need to say that. Please consider making a donation to the Great Northern to support our programming with the QR code on the screen. Or go to thegreatnorthern.com. Programming keeps going through February 4th. This is not just a one-day event. It's going on for a long time. Please check out the full lineup at thegreatnorthernfestival.com. And we will see you all soon downstairs. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you, guys.